welcome to the Brand Forum. I'm really excited for this next episode. I'm Jeremy Bloom. With me, I've got my co-host, Josh Palau.
How's it going?
I'm great. How are you, my friend?
I'm great. I'm excited about this one. My eighth grade self is really kind of come out of this interview.
I couldn't agree more. And with us today, we have Tim Lapetino. Tim, I want you to give your background because when you and I met about a year ago, and when you told me what you do for a living, my childhood, when Josh was in eighth grade, I'll say I was in sixth grade, and I was like, "Oh my God, that is one of the coolest jobs in the entire world." Why don't you tell us what you do?
Yeah, well, I am the creative director at Atari, and
Amazing.
it is an amazing job. Not just because I happened to found my way there, but basically I'm in charge of the team that we run branding, packaging, brand identity. We work on marketing for our new games and our retro games, and we work with our licensing team. So we really have our hands in much of the creative work that goes into supporting the brand and also putting out products that modern day Atari releases.
That is an awesome job, and it's funny because when Jeremy introduced you, it's like, oh, we're introduce that we're gonna speak to the creative director. There's a part of, because we focus this on brand building, but this one to me was so like sort of interesting because of the fact of the role that creative plays in everything. And so we talked a little bit earlier. I mean, I'd love for you to just give that whole riff of like where creative meets this whole piece of the business that sometimes gets lost, frankly, because we're so stuck in this algorithmic world. But you have such a great, take on it, and I think it leans in perfectly to what you do. So I'm gonna let you go.
Yeah, I mean, being a heritage brand, Atari, we have a 50 plus year history. We have a lot of, we have as much history behind us as any really American company that's still existing. So for us, it's this delicate balance of continuing to tap into the nostalgia for the fans of our brand that knew it from decades past. But it's also, how do we continue to evolve this company and still be able to be connected to our roots, but also be evolving as we continue to look at second and third generation fans? How do we capture the things that are important for a heritage brand like ours, but also we're keeping it forward in the brand storytelling, which is a delicate dance we're always doing. How do we make sure that we are not opaque to younger generations or people maybe who are less familiar? But then also, how do we really like hit that dopamine hit of nostalgia for the people like myself, like you all, who grew up with this brand, and it instantly transports them back, to the 80s or the 70s.
Yeah, that's great. I was thinking in the way that sort of plays out. I'd love to hear, like, if you have an example or just a philosophy, like just the way, like how you work with your brand teams, your agencies. And I'm not necessarily interested in the mechanics. It's more about, like, as a creative, I always feel like sometimes you get boxed in because it's like, well, it's got to do this, it's got to do that, it's got to perform. But for a brand like yours, it's I feel like creative almost has to be the lead. But again, in a performance-driven world, like I would just love to hear how you how you guys navigate that, and actually more importantly, like, how does that impact the creative process that you're coming up with? Do you find your teams limiting themselves? Are they pushing forward? I'd love to just hear like some of the cool stuff.
Yeah, I try to keep bringing it back to storytelling, right? It's like, what is the story that we're telling about this brand? It's not just looking back and looking at our history, although that is the case. I look at it as like, we have this amazing storehouse of treasures that we can pull out at any point historically. Hey, we did this. We had basically, popularized the joystick, right? When people think of a one button controller, that's us. Right. We're also totally tied to the 80s. When people think of retro brands, either, with a microscope or just more generally, people think of us. So like those are the real positives. It's just like we have this treasure trove of things that we can say. People are like, I remember that. I mean, I can tell you how many times we're out in the world and people are like, oh, Atari, that was my first console, or that looks like how I grew up with. So that's the positive side. The challenge is for it to be a millstone around our neck, right? And I think for my team, a lot of times we talk about these are things we've done in the past, and I think with previous versions of this company, it's a relatively new incarnation of the company in the last 4 to 5 years. earlier versions either were really focused on the, just ignoring it all, like we're moving forward, we're totally different, or they were so shackled by the past. Well, old Atari did this, so we have to do it that way, right? And I've been trying to, I love the original Atari team, right? I know some of them. I got started on this writing a book about it, and that was the real interest for me, is who were those people. So I actually literally know these people, and I can talk to them and even say, why did you do this or that? But at the same time, I have 25 years in branding and brand strategy and design, where I have some of my own opinions about how we do this work in the 21st century. So I, I can choose. Some things we're going to do, some things we're not going to do, some things we're going to leave behind, some things maybe weren't great ideas, right? And so, there's a sifting there, and it requires a real knowledge of the history and why some of those things were done. But it's also, we really have to treat this like a 21st century brand.
This week on Dishing with Divas, we're exploring the wild snack aisle of the media marketplace with Farah Bazaminian, Global Vice President of Data Monetization at TiVo. Flavors are popping up faster than ever. Some sweet, some spicy, and some downright unexpected. Just like audiences sampling content across more platforms. Farah, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges advertisers and programmers face in understanding how audiences watch TV and video today?
Well, with so many options and touch points on how to access video content, it's really about keeping up with how consumers are actually watching TV. Their behavior is evolving faster than measurement and monetization models can adapt to. It is really what's requiring us to be agile and incorporate data interoperability that comes with consistency and coverage.
Makes so much sense. Thank you, Farah, for helping us sample the full spread of insights. Whether audiences are crunching linear, nibbling streaming, or snacking on social clips, understanding the full spectrum of flavors is what keeps advertisers and programmers ahead of the game.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I think as you think through like how that impacts the consumer, because, the statements are the obvious, but everything's always changing. And yeah, I mean, I've spent many a quarter playing a lot of your games on my way back from school. And so I think it's like, so as I think through that one, so is there a campaign or an idea that you just had like thought through and been like, wow, that's a moment where I saw like how creative really drove brand. It's almost like in the reverse, when we talk to more historical brand marketers, the question's usually like, when was the time you knew that marketing worked? And it's almost like for you, like, when was the time like you knew like, hey, the creative, like it worked and it made this campaign?
Yeah, I think some of it is about strategy, right? It's coming back to the strategy. So we just announced a product earlier this year. We did a collaboration with the people who own Pac-Man, Bandai Namco, right? And we announced this new version of our 2600 Plus. It's our console. We've re-released the original 2600, but you can plug it into modern TVs. It has all kinds of wireless capabilities. But it's basically still cartridge based, right? So we have this product that's done very well for us. And we taught them about a collaboration where we do a Pac-Man version of that console that, is, you can pre-order this now. It comes with different ghost colored joysticks. And we really wanted to bring those two brands together in a way that they hadn't been really since the 80s. Right. And so a lot of this was just like, oh, well, Pac-Man's this huge brand. Everybody knows Pac-Man. And it really is true. And my focus on, once we had this idea that had been germinating for a while, was how do we make it not just Pac-Man, because there's a certain way Pac-Man is marketed and designed and done, for decades, but how can we make it Atari Pac-Man? And so we really dialed into our history and said, hey, before, back in the Wild West of licensing, Atari handled Pac-Man differently because we were allowed to, because it was the early 80s, and we wanted to go back to that time where we had our own Pac-Man art, our own approach, our own visual take on that. And the folks at Bandai Namco were very willing to let us go down that road with them. And that has been one of the most powerful things about launching this product. People see a somewhat fresh version of Pac-Man, but also they see our version of Pac-Man, right? It's still Bandai Namco's, character, but they're hungry for something that feels like it comes from the history, and it's organically so. And we really, really tried to grow this out of the same, archival, like seeds, whatever the term is for that, like those original seeds. We try to
Yeah.
grow it out of that same place.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'd call it the seeds of nostalgia, where as a consumer, I'm 99.999% positive I have seen ads for it in the wild. Legit, I've seen it on Instagram. I probably clicked on it thinking, oh my God, that's amazing. There's a lot to unpack in what you've been saying, Tim. So let's even take a step back. What's your book called? We want to be able to give you a shout
I was going to
out.
ask that one.
Yeah. So the book I wrote is called Art of Atari, and it really grew. It really
You
grew
really got
up.
a niche there, Tim.
Yes, yeah, and this was almost 10 years ago now that book came out. But it grew out of my background both as a journalist and as a brand designer, like really worked on brand identity and logos and all that stuff. And I thought, like, hey, you've got the Nike swoosh, you've got the IBM logo, you've got all these sort of paragons of great logos of the 20th century that, as a brand designer, we all kind of know the creation stories of the Apple logo, right? But there's this other logo, this Atari logo that no one was really talking about. Where did that come from? And where did that art, that great art on those boxes, who did that? In my
Yeah.
career, I'm really interested in creative process, right? So I started digging and I started looking into who were those people. The original creative director, George Opperman at Atari, they were really kind of unsung heroes. And I was able to connect to some of those people, some of the artists. And after really kind of doing some due diligence, I thought, if anybody, really remembers that era and can speak intelligently from a sort of a branding and creative standpoint, this could be a great book. And one thing led to another. That book, did very well. I was able to bring back a lot of this old art that people had not seen, since the 80s. We put it all in a really archival sort of volume. And for me, like, that was a really fun experience, but it also opened the door from being a corporate designer, and strategist and writer into, like, really, that was me getting back into the pop culture world. So it led to video games and, film and all these other things, action figure packaging, all these things that I sort of grew up with and are sort of you can see from my office,
Yeah.
they're peppering, it's inspiration for me. But then I really got to start working in those industries.
When I think about career and when I think about just who people are from a personality settings, and no, very few careers are completely linear, but doing something that you love and from a passion play, going and writing about something that you are passionate about, to then being able to morph that into what you do on a daily basis, of whether it is the 70s, 80s, 90s pop culture, the branding strategy and design, bringing back and being part of the team that's bringing back Atari, spending so much time writing a book and going to the different stakeholders that help develop such a legacy brand. Why don't you walk us through for a moment, Tim, just how this all came about? Because please.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, there's a lot of super fans, right? And I've made, the second half of my career about, connecting to these sort of super fandoms, right? So I'm not the biggest super fandom, person, but I guess what I've done is I've taken that fandom, but then I've kind of merged it with my professional practice, if you will, right? I've spending decades working with companies that, make gluten-free noodle packaging, or, things like we worked with a company that was developing a new kind of asphalt, right? All these different things, lighting companies, some of them were very sexy, some of them less so. I spent years in food packaging and spirits, right? So understanding how to help people turn consumer products into things that come to life, for people. But then you merge that with sort of my sort of side interests. I'm not just being like, hey, I'm Atari's #1 fan and I want to do this. Like, when you give the keys to those people, like, that's not always the best thing. I mean, we talk a lot about, like, inside Atari, and this is not me. This is just, before I was in here, merging sort of passion and excellence, right? It's not enough just to be excited about it. And it's not enough just to be great, but you don't care. You've got to have both those things. And so I came in, as somebody who cut their teeth in packaging, in brand strategy, in logo design, in, all these things, and then really applying that thinking to this brand that had this really sort of chewy concept, not just great history, but like it's a challenge to operate this this brand in a great way. Like it's as a creative person, like every day I wake up and be like, we got to figure out how to do all this. We have the baggage of, we're carrying 50 years of history. Sometimes it's heavy. Sometimes it's a huge asset. Mostly it's a huge asset. But like, the second question I will get sometimes from people you work at Atari? Wait, Atari's still around? Like, and we're trying to excise that question from the conversation long term. But being able to say, hey, there's things that are germane to running creative at Atari that are the same for any, company that's creative driven. And then there's things that are very unique for us and saying, hey, you know what? I need to speak to my Gen X brethren, but then I also need to make sure that we're not cutting 20 somethings out of the conversation and everybody in between.
Yeah, it's funny, the passion piece of it. I'd be a horrible Nike like as good as I am as my job. If I had that job at Nike, I would spend way too much time down in the shoe lab, and I would not do well. So it's nice that you're able to balance that, because I would be bad at it. But I have to ask the question. It's my last question. But I mean, you're creative is one of the worlds is one of the areas that's being so disrupted by AI. And by the way, I can't express how much I hate AI questions. It's so, but it's so prevalent in your craft. And because of the storytelling and everything you've talked about, how do you guys balance out like using these things, bringing them into stories? Like, how are you thinking about it? And I would love the Atari answer, or just the Tim answer, because you've got such a background in all of this.
Yeah, I think that I'll answer the Tim answer, because I think a lot of things remain to be seen. But for me, I think AI is going to be a useful production tool, right? It'll shorten the time of things, the way we make certain things, but it's still a cart without a horse, right? And it has to be driven, and if people think that you're going to replace creative people with their intuition and their skills and experience with AI, I think that's a misnomer. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I do think it'll help us get to things more quickly, but I think you need people to with their judgment and their guidance to be able to look beyond the situation into the unintended consequences, or into like the strategy, or just like, how do you make something that just makes people smile, right? Those are all human things of storytelling, and those are not going to get replaced by AI.
That's great. Yeah, that's refreshing to hear.
So the final question, I have two kids. I have a almost 13-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. My 10-year-old son is definitely into video games. When you had mentioned a few minutes ago about the 20-somethings, what about I think it's the Generation Alphas, I could be mistaken, but the 10, 11-year-olds that are playing on their current consoles, but have the nostalgia of parents that will still talk about Nintendo, that will talk about Atari. Tell us a little bit about just like the branding component and strategy to attract, to get younger folks excited about gaming with such a legacy brand.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I have a test lab of my own two kids who are 13 and 10, and so they're very willing to tell me, oh, this is fun, or this is lame, Dad.
Yeah.
Although they said, Dad, no one says lame anymore. And I'm like, okay,
No cap,
is
no
it
cap.
mid? Yeah, I don't know. But, I very much think that like Atari, we're really well positioned, because what we do and what we've done is a lot like the casual games. The whole thing where you pick up and play something for half an hour, right? 15 minutes. Like, that's a lot of what we make. It's not everything, but it's a lot. And I think kids, especially if they can get over that's old, or that's something my dad likes, which makes it automatically uncool. Like, if you can get past that, I think really fun games are fun games. And my 10-year-old, he loves Atari, but he also has a Nintendo Switch. He also plays games on the original NES. He doesn't care where it comes from as long as it's fun. Right. So we look at those kids as sort of second and third generation Atari fans, and maybe their parents who grew up with this stuff are going to, walk them into the world. But, do we have compelling, fun things to play, that sit alongside everything else they do? And if we do that, then I think it's good. But we know that they're new audiences. So we have to make sure we're not speaking insider, Gen X speak. We're doing it in a way that makes sense to them.
That's great. Awesome. You have a great story, Tim.
Thank you.
No doubt, Tim. This has been a lot of fun. Josh, as always, thank you. We really appreciate it. This is such a fun, creative episode. Keep up the awesome work.
Great. Thanks so much. It's great talking to you guys.
Thank you, Tim.